All right, guys, this is Mr. DeCecco. Welcome back. If you're here, it's because you watched the first video on Reconstruction, and today we're going to take you through the end of Reconstruction. So if you got your video sheet and you're ready to roll, let's get it going, all right? There are many events that contributed or led to the end of Reconstruction. Listed here are just a few of them to get you started, and we'll go over specifics in a minute. Once again, Reconstruction lasted from 1865 at the end of the Civil War up until 1877. So what are the kind of overarching reasons that are there? First of all, there was way too much corruption in Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. Right? It weakened the Republican Party. It made citizens pretty much want to give up on trusting the federal government and trusting Reconstruction. Former Confederates began voting again, mostly Democratic, which led to the Solid South voting Democratically. The Democratic was so dominant, once again, what was its term? The Solid South. From about 1870s to 1900, the South voted Democratically every single presidential election. And then, obviously, the election of 1876 led to the Compromise of 1877, which officially ends Reconstruction. So let's take a look at that election of 1876. All right, two big candidates. Obviously, you have the Democratic Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York, who got most of his support from the South, and then there was the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the governor of Ohio. Tilden will win the popular vote, but there's a couple states where the electoral votes are disputed. So Congress creates a special electoral commission to decide the election, and what do? They make a deal. All right, so first thing you got to know is the deal. We'll get to that in a second. Obviously, if you look at the electoral vote, it's very close. So that commission determined who was going to have the edge in the electoral vote. If we look to the popular vote, it's pretty easy to see that the Democratic Tilden, the Southern guy, probably should have won the election. But once again, there is a special commission which will decide the election, and they come up with a deal known as the Compromise of 1877. What the Democrats actually agreed to is easy. They're going to give the Republicans the presidency. They didn't care about having their guy in as president. All they wanted was this bullet right here. They wanted the federal government to take all the remaining federal troops out of the South. And once the federal government takes those troops out, those white people down south, they can pretty much do whatever they want. So we say that officially ends Reconstruction. There's a couple other smaller parts to that compromise. The biggest one is obviously those troops leaving. The Southerners decided that if this Republican Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be president, they wanted one of their people, a Southerner, in the cabinet so they can keep an eye on him. And they basically told the federal government they needed to continue to spend government money, federal government money, to rebuild the South. So there's your points to that compromise. Nice little outline here. Just kind of sets you up timeline as to when things are happening. I like to throw these in there to give you some idea of when the events are happening so you can understand the skill of periodization. So the Civil War ends 1865. That same year, Lincoln is assassinated in April. That same year, the 13th Amendment is ratified, no slavery. 1867, the first Reconstruction Acts are passed to kind of change the South and to change their lifestyle. 1868 is a huge year. President Andrew Johnson is impeached. He's charged with breaking the Tenure of Office Act. There was a trial, and he was innocent by one vote. Also, the 14th Amendment is ratified, and that guarantees equal protection under the law if you're a citizen. So you should know that. Towards the end of Reconstruction, Congress added another amendment, the 15th Amendment, which said all African-American men can vote. 1872, Ulysses S. Grant is reelected. He pardons Confederate officials. We're getting towards the end of Reconstruction. And then obviously in 1876, when Hayes becomes president, it is the official end of Reconstruction. So just a few more to go here. We'll get to the end. White control back in the South after 1877. As long as the federal troops are gone, the Southerners begin to limit the advances made by African Americans. There were other efforts that were used to curb their actual rights, African American rights. So, well, I'm going to take you through some of the ugliness of Reconstruction, and you'll see that. One of which is obviously the poll tax, right? You had to pay a poll tax before you can vote. That'll show up later on in one of these slides, right? White control in the South, well, they instituted things called black codes. Now, you have to know that black codes are going to be laws passed by the southern state governments. These are not laws passed by the federal government. These are southern state laws. And they were based on the old slave codes. They were based and aimed at keeping African Americans really in conditions that are going to be close to slavery. They just can't call it that. To give you some idea, black codes exclusively in the South. They're really harsh. The Jim Crow laws, we go back, made it where black people get arrested for almost anything. And if you got arrested, you had to pay off your fine. And usually they were going to put you back on somebody's farm. Okay. Besides the law that changes down south, there were secret societies. And the one people are most familiar with is the Ku Klux Klan. Right? And the aim of this group originally was to simply frighten African Americans from even kind of roaming around and even thinking about voting and those sorts of things. So the Klan soon began using other terror, other types of terror as a tool to keep people in line to basically take their rights away from African Americans. So you have your beatings, they're burning crosses on front lawns, burning down African American churches and lynchings, and pretty scary group. I mean, when you see them all dressed up in the cloak and everything. I know we particularly went over this in class. If you weren't there, nice political cartoon of the Klan, and they're saying that now Reconstruction, this is worse than slavery. These people are terrified, right? And what does the Klan want? Does the Union as it was? They want to go back to the life, to the way it was, even before the war even started. So, when you see this word here, disfranchise, when you disfranchise someone, you basically take their rights away. And in this term, we're looking at how are these people disfranchising this poor black man right here? Well, he's thinking about voting, but when these two guys are members of the Klan, is he going to actually put that in a ballot box? Probably not. Right? We do our best to keep every Negro in our state from voting, right? This is people from Congress who were talking back then. These are, obviously, you see the Carolinas, Virginias, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. This is where you would see this type of thing, right? White control in the South. How do they keep, African Americans from voting? They instituted things called poll taxes. Poll tax, pretty simple to understand. Southern states impose a simple tax on every voter. Well, why would you do it? Those who were poor could not vote. Well, who was poor? The African Americans. So what are you doing? If you can't pay the tax, you can't vote. So basically what they did was they took rights away from African Americans, right? So this guy's there, he's ready to vote, and they're like, hey, where's your tax? Can't pay it? Well, can't vote, right? They also instituted literacy tests, right? Southern states required citizens simply to pass a test whether they can read or write. If you pass the test, you can vote. Well, we know that most of the African Americans did not receive an equal education and were denied to go to those schools. So poor whites and even African Americans, they couldn't read, so therefore they couldn't vote. Can't pass the test, can't vote, right? So your voters take literacy tests here, you take the test, you pass, you can vote, right? And a joke here is, you see, by the way, what's that big word? And the guy doesn't even understand what literacy is, right? Because you can't read it right. There were things done to aid African Americans, and the biggest of which will be the Freedmen's Bureau. I can't tell you enough that you should really study this. It is created directly at the war's end and the beginning of Reconstruction, because it was designed to help out the freedmen. The freedmen, there's 4.5 million slaves, and with the 13th Amendment in 1865, slaves are now freedmen, right? So what did it do? Establish schools for young African Americans. It was designed to aid them in any way possible: homes, jobs, healthcare, food, even education. But its biggest goals were made in education and schools. Its biggest goals were not made with providing everyone with a home, everyone with a job. Why? Well, you had a lot of government officials who thought it was more important to maybe steal some of that money for themselves rather than doing what they was designed to do. So there was a lot of corruption. And what were people doing? They were stealing money, right? Besides the poll tax and literacy test, oh, there, a famous picture right there. You can't forget that, right? Freedmen School, the biggest goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was to give this group of people right here an education. If you give them an education, they can get their own jobs, they can get their own health care, they can take care of themselves. So that's what's going on with the Freedmen's Bureau. Besides the poll taxes and the literacy test, because if you were a poor white person, you couldn't pay the tax, you couldn't vote. Well, if you were a poor white person, you probably didn't have education, you couldn't pass that test, or you can't vote. So those two agencies are kind of barring poor whites and African Americans from voting. So we want to do something to help out the white people, but certainly not the black people, right? So what did the southern states do? They added what were called grandfather clauses to help the whites, not the blacks. And these, once again, are instituted by southern states. Got to keep in mind what the federal government is doing and then what those southern state governments are doing. And basically what it said was, if you couldn't pay the tax, or you couldn't read and write, but your ancestor, a grandfather, father, someone voted in the 1866-1867 election, you were still allowed to vote. Now, think about that. What African American people were voting in 1866, 1867? Not too many of them, because the 15th Amendment did not come out until 1868. So basically, this was put in place to help out poor white people and to keep African American people from voting. So you could put the grandfather clauses, the literacy test, and the poll taxes all together. Very few African Americans voted in 1867, so this clause specifically only benefited the whites. If you need to do the vocabulary for my worksheets and everything, you can pause that there to take care of that. There's your black codes, literacy test, and grandfather clauses. So they're there for you. All right. White control in the South. We also refer to that as the Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws, once again, are Southern state laws they established for segregation. Right. These are not laws created by the federal government, although the federal government will back them up. These are laws created by the southern states, right? They became firmly established down south right at the end of Reconstruction. They required separating African Americans from white people in all facets of life. Well, you give me some examples here, right? Schools, parks, public buildings, public transportations, libraries, theaters, the list goes on and on. So really they wanted to separate white and black people throughout the South during this time period, right? There was a court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. And what that court case did was it set up, and our Supreme Court in 1896 set up, and they said, hey, segregation is legal. And that Supreme Court case basically legalized segregation for a very long time, up until, the 1950s. And this is what was happening in like the 1860s, 1870s. The NAACP, so the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, would later on challenge these situations, challenge these up until their, up until the 1950s and 60s. So that's just giving you an example of separation of, there's a white drinking fountain and the colored drinking fountain. There's another example there for you, all right? Well, what did the Supreme Court do about it, right? This is going to be pretty simple, right? The Supreme Court actually doesn't interfere with Plessy v. Ferguson. They tend to not really mess with it. And most of the Supreme Court's decisions up until the 1960s allowed it to happen, right? So there's a couple cases here that you should be aware of in understanding exactly what happened with the Supreme Court. There was a bunch of cases, but the Supreme Court ruled the 13th Amendment got rid of slavery, but it didn't say anything about discrimination. You're going to have to wait till 1964 for the federal government to come up with something for discrimination, which is kind of sad. And then the 14th Amendment said it prohibited discrimination. It made sure there was equal treatment from the government, but not against individuals. So if an individual did you wrong or did something to you, the federal government was not going to interfere. If some government treated you wrong, then the federal government says, hey, the 14th Amendment applies here, right? So you should know that court case. Once again, Plessy v. Ferguson, the court ruled that segregation was absolutely legal. You could do it as long as you gave separate facilities. And I showed you the pictures of the two drinking fountains and what was happening there. All right. If you need that vocabulary, I'll pause that for a second. Hitting that case again. It's the third time I hit this case in this video, so go back and study it, right? It set a precedent for legal segregation in all public facilities. That policy will last until the 1950s and 1960s. In schools, in this court case, 1954, our Supreme Court finally reversed that decision. They said that they were wrong and that equal facilities separated by race were not, but were by nature unequal. So what they're saying is you can't do that anymore. So instead of separating black and white, now we're going to bring black and white together. All right. There's two leading African Americans up until kind of your Dr. King years and your Malcolm X years. So who are the two guys you should know early on? Well, that is Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And they offer two different strategies to improve the lives of African Americans. I'm going to fix that. It should be lives, not lines, lives. Well, first of all, remember the W here. Just remember the W. Washington claimed African Americans should set aside political equality and focus on gaining vocational skills. What's vocational skills? Be a carpenter, become a plumber, learn a trade, get a job, and just prove to white people that you can contribute to society and you're just as good as they are. And by the way, keep your mouth shut. Don't cause any ruckus. Don't worry about segregation. It'll go away on its own. And Washington is basically like, if you work hard and live an honest life, you're going to be okay. Well, Du Bois, just remember the D here. Right here, D, demand. Du Bois, demand. Washington, go to work. Du Bois, demand. Du Bois says that African Americans should gain degrees, should go to schools, not just go out to the workforce and become very educated and to demand social and political equality. So both these guys want to improve the lives of African Americans, but they're going about it a different way. Washington, work. Du Bois, demand. If that helps you, you're in business. I know in class we took the time at the end to look over, hey, what did Reconstruction do that was good and what did it fail at doing? So I'm going to toggle back and forth here. We'll look at the success and then we'll look at the dismal failure, right? So our country got back together. The Union was restored. That was great. But many white Southerners were very bitter toward the federal government, toward the Republican Party, and they certainly weren't going to be willing to treat black people equally anytime soon. That's a failure. What's the success? The South's economy, which traditionally was agriculture, it begins to change. There's new wealth created and it begins to grow, but it does not industrialize as equally as the North. All right. What are some successes? We have these great amendments now that are going to provide for citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights for African American males. But after those federal troops leave in 1877, Southern state governments, terrorist organizations effectively deny the right to vote to African American males. Success, but if you don't live up to it, it becomes a failure, right? Freedmen's Bureau definitely helped out the freedmen as best they could. But what do we see after Reconstruction during the late 1800s? Many black and white Southerners remain caught in a cycle of poverty or sharecropping. They can never get out of it, right? Successes. There is mandatory free education in all of these schools down south. Before the Civil War, there was not. Now there is. That's nice. But racist attitudes towards African Americans continue in both the North and the South, where African Americans began moving. So when we look at the time period, it's a very good time period, but there are definitely things the federal government needs to do better at. So I look forward to helping you any way I can. Make sure you study these notes, do the worksheets, study the vocab, and we'll see you soon. Bye.